Hey, happy Wednesday morning, everyone. Welcome back to Morning Musings. Just doing a little bit more study and reading here in Joel Richardson's Mystery Babylon, Unlocking the Bible's Greatest Prophetic Mystery. Do not forget, this upcoming Friday, I will have installment number 2 in our review and response to Mr. Richardson's book, in which he claims that the Islamic movement is, in fact, Babylon of Revelation. I believe that's absolutely false. I believe that it is a distortion of the evidence that we find not only in Revelation, but in the entire corpus of biblical prophecy. I believe he's grossly missed the mark. I will be sharing with you some of those reasons on Friday. Be looking forward to that. Well, don't forget, July 12th through 14th, Preterist Pilgrim Weekend, Ardmore, Oklahoma. All right, we're looking at the resurrection of Romans 8, 1 Corinthians chapter 15. In both passages, we have the anticipation of the putting off of the mortal body, of the putting off of the bondage of corruption, putting an end to futility. Now, I've been sharing with you the identity of that creation and the nature of that futility. I want you to notice that in Romans chapter 8, Paul makes allusion is not the right word. Paul says the whole creation groans in labor pains until now. Wow. Paul introduces to the reader. And remember, Paul says, I'm writing to those who know the law, Romans 7:1. He's writing to people who are very familiar with an Old Testament concept known as the birth pangs of Messiah. Look, this is one of the most fascinating of subjects. In my book, We Shall Meet Him in the Air, the Wedding of the King of Kings, I demonstrate that in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 and verse 3, when Paul talks about the day of the Lord coming upon them as labor pains upon a woman with child, he's drawing upon that same database, if you please. Let me share something with you. In the Jewish eschatological timeline, in the narrative, if you please, there was a belief that in the last days, certain things would happen. Those things are absolutely interconnected with one another. You cannot divorce them from each other temporally. In other words, you don't have one and then 1,000 years later another, and then 2,000 years later you have another one. That is just simply not in the Jewish eschatological narrative. That's one of the things that is wrong with the dispensational view. When they go to Daniel chapter 9 and they say, oh, well, look, you have the 69th week fulfilled, and then you have so far a 2,000-year gap between the 69th and the 70th week. I'm sorry, folks, that is not in the Jewish timeline. Likewise, we have individuals saying, well, in Daniel chapter 12 and verse 1, you have the prediction of the Great Tribulation. That supposedly happened in the days of Antiochus Epiphanes. But then, in Daniel chapter 12 verse 2, you have the prediction of the resurrection at the end of time. You've just got this humongous gap between the statement of Daniel 12 verse 1, at that time, this great tribulation would take place, and then supposedly Daniel is given this parenthetical prediction with no grammatical indication, no contextual indication whatsoever. All of a sudden, without any indication, verse 2, oh, by the way, there's going to be a resurrection at the so-called end of time. And of course, there is no biblical text that refers to the end of time. Now, I give that in order to drive home the point that when Paul alludes to the birth pangs in Romans chapter 8, that he is drawing on a wealth of Jewish thought, a world of theology that unfortunately many people today, many Bible students, good people, are absolutely unaware of. They haven't invested the time or the effort to investigate this wealth of material. But folks, I want to tell you, it is critical for the proper interpretation of Romans chapter 8. It is critical to see how Paul is drawing on passage after passage after passage from the Old Testament that absolutely tie together the great tribulation and the resurrection. It is absolutely wrong, it is anti-biblical to divorce the birth pangs of Messiah, which are nothing less than the Great Tribulation and the resurrection. Here's a rough outline, and again, in my book, We Shall Meet Him in the Air, The Wedding of the King of Kings, I developed this extensively. In some Jewish texts, you'll find a flip-flopping of, well, this one goes here and that one goes there, but they all agree that every one of these constituent elements belong to the last days. And those last days do not extend for thousands of years. But in that Jewish narrative, there was the belief that you would have the appearing of Elijah before the coming of the great and the terrible day of the Lord. Number two, you would have the great apostasy, in which those in Israel would fall away. Now, here's where you sometimes find a little bit of flip-flop. Sometimes you find the Great Tribulation first, and then the Great Apostasy, and the Great Apostasy being a direct result of the Great Tribulation. But the Great Tribulation is seen as the birth pangs of Messiah. The time of Jacob's trouble, we'll look at that. And here in this eschatological narrative, you have the birth pangs of Messiah, you have the great apostasy, and you have the coming of the Lord in the kingdom, in the judgment, and the resurrection. Now look, if Paul in Romans 8 is referring to the birth pangs of Messiah, and he says the whole creation has been groaning together in labor pains until now. Paul's now takes on a temporal significance when coupled with all of the time elements that he gives in Romans 8 of the imminence of the coming glory. It means without a doubt whatsoever that the labor pains were just about over. It means the time of deliverance had arrived. It means the resurrection was at hand. So, in our very next video, I'm going to share with you, I've already shared with you Isaiah 26. I'm going to share with you some of the many Old Testament prophecies which foretold the last days and foretold the birth pangs of Messiah that would give way to the resurrection and the kingdom. Look, you do not want to miss this. This is awesome stuff, and it proves beyond a shadow of a doubt the resurrection was to be in the first century. Stay tuned. We'll see you on the flip side.